How did Paul get to Rome after leaving Malta? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts on walking through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Acts chapter 28, verses 11 to 16. Before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Acts chapter 28, verse 11. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Acts chapter 28, beginning at verse 11. After 3 months, we sailed in an Alexandrian ship whose figurehead was the twin brothers, which had wintered at the island, and landing at Syracuse, we stayed 3 days. From there we circled round and reached Rhegium. And after 1 day the south wind blew, and the next day we came to Puteoli, where we found brethren, and were invited to stay with them 7 days. And so we went towards Rome. And from there, when the brethren heard about us, they came to meet us as far as Apiforum and the 3 Inns. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. Now when we came to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard, but Paul was permitted to dwell by himself with the soldier who guarded him. Paul's harrowing journey from Palestine to Rome is almost over. He left in early fall the previous year in order to appeal his case to Nero, but due to terrible weather, the ship he was sailing on was shipwrecked in Malta. The inhabitants of Malta were very hospitable to Paul and his traveling companions during the 3-month stay on the island. And Paul took the opportunity to heal people of their diseases, signs of which would confirm the gospel of Jesus Christ, so we can know that Paul also preached while he was there too. That Paul never stopped taking opportunities to preach wherever he went should be an example for us to follow today. People wonder why more don't become Christians. The question I ask is, are we preaching the gospel? Are we inviting people to classes? Are we inviting people to come and worship with the church? If the answer is no, then no wonder more people don't become Christians. We can't hide our light under a bushel and expect God to miraculously bring people to Christ. He has not promised to do that. He wants the gospel preached, and as long as it is, it will convert people. Now it might not be many, but it will be more than if we stood by and did nothing. Preaching is the method by which God chose to send out the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so let's all be active in preaching that gospel. Coming to verse 11, let's examine how much time has passed. We know based on the time marker of the Day of Atonement that Paul left Palestine somewhere in early to mid-September. He arrived in Fair Havens probably 3 to 4 weeks later. That means 1 month. He was on the sea before becoming shipwrecked for 2 weeks, and says he remained on Malta for 3 months, but we shouldn't mean this to be exactly to the day, so let's say 4 months from Crete to the end of the stay at Malta, meaning 5 months total. That means we're either in March or approaching March, depending on how close to the Day of Atonement they left Palestine. And of course, this makes sense, for Paul said that he had wintered in Malta. Almost half a year, and Paul hasn't arrived in Rome. And in fact, the rest of the journey could be another month based on the time markers mentioned in today's reading, meaning that it would have taken half a year to get to Rome. Paul had been imprisoned for 2 years previously. The end of the book will tell us that he will spend 2 more years in Rome. So this imprisonment totaled 4.5 years. That's a long time to be imprisoned on false charges. But with God's protection, Paul was safe, and he was able to teach in spite of being in prison. In Malta, the centurion was able to get passage for all those who had been shipwrecked on an Alexandrian ship that had wintered on the island, whose figurehead was the twin brothers. The twin brothers are also known as Castor and Pollux, and they were brothers in Greek and Roman mythology. For those who practice the false practice of astrology, those twin brothers would be better known as the sign Gemini. From Malta, Paul, with Luke still with him, came to Syracuse on the island of Sicily today. Syracuse is about 160 kilometers or 100 miles from Malta, and is a city that still exists. After 3 days, they sailed to Rhegium, what today would be known as Reggio Calabria. It does not appear that they intended to stop here, but for one day the winds prevented them from traveling further up the west coast of Italy. After the winds died down, they sailed to Puteoli, which is modern-day Pozzuoli. Puteoli's importance is due to the security of its harbor and the lack of any decent harbors closer to Rome. In fact, until the construction of the harbor of Ostia in Rome by Claudius Caesar, who reigned from 41 AD to 54 AD, Puteoli was the main harbor for the city of Rome, even though Rome is about 274 kilometers or 170 miles away. Much of the commerce from Egypt and Israel passed through Puteoli on its way to Rome. In Puteoli, Paul found Christians there and stayed with them for 7 days and were encouraged. Think about that for a moment. Paul was a prisoner, and yet here he is allowed to delay the journey to Rome by a week in order to visit with Christians. This is how much respect that Paul has earned along this journey with the Roman commanders. The rest of the journey to Rome is on foot, a journey of about 210 kilometers or 130 miles. Along the way, Paul met even more Christians who encouraged him on his journey to Rome. And so in verse 16, we finally get to Rome. It is a city that Paul has never visited, though he told the Romans at the end of the book of Romans, which was likely written about 3 years earlier while in Corinth, that he desired to do so. Up on the screen now is what Rome would have looked like in the 4th century AD, but some of those structures would have been present in Paul's day. The most famous one, the Colosseum, wasn't there, though, as it was completed about a decade or so after Paul's death. What we can see, though, is that in the 1st century, Rome was a metropolitan capital, a city of wealth for sure. Upon arrival, the Roman centurion who was keeping Paul delivered him and the other prisoners to the captain of the guard. And while the other prisoners were put in jail with the common criminals, Paul was permitted to dwell by himself, with soldiers standing on guard to ensure that he didn't escape. Yet again, we see how Paul was treated differently than practically any other prisoner, owing to not only the tremendous respect that they have for Paul, but for really the tacit admission that they knew Paul was innocent and stood a high likelihood of being released. What would Paul do in Rome? We'll find that out, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Acts chapter 28, verses 17 to 31, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.